Welcome, everyone, and thanks for joining us. I am Philip Himberg, the Executive Director of MacDowell, America's first artist residency, founded in 1907 by Edward and Marion MacDowell. Every year, over 300 artists across 7 artistic genres apply and are invited to our campus, 450 bucolic acres in Peterborough, New Hampshire. These artists represent fiction, nonfiction writers, journalists, composers, playwrights, visual artists, filmmakers, architects, and interdisciplinary inventors. The artists stay for up to 2 months at MacDowell, free of charge, of course, residing in one of our 32 studios, where lunch is delivered daily in an iconic MacDowell picnic basket, and where at dinner, the artists gather together to share food and conversation. The goal of MacDowell has always been quite simple: to provide space and time and community for creative souls to make enduring works of the imagination. For 114 years now, MacDowell's have been described by artists as a kind of haven. It has attracted such talents as James Baldwin, for whom our library is named, Faith Ringgold, Michael Chabon, Alice Walker, Thornton Wilder, and more recently, theatrical composer Jeanine Tesori, playwright Jeremy O. Harris, playwright and novelist Ayad Akhtar, as well as Ta-Nehisi Coates, Jackie Woodson, Meredith Monk, and James Lapine, just to name a few. And 3 of the 4 individuals who are in conversation with us today are also MacDowell Fellows. Today's conversation is part of a series, an ongoing collaboration between MacDowell and the 92nd Street Y, an institution founded even before MacDowell came to be, and one like MacDowell, which believes very much in the power of art to impact and imprint the world. MacDowell offers 2 opportunities: chosen isolation, in which to work, and as importantly, the rare circumstance for art makers across disciplines to exchange ideas. And our hope today is that through this exchange, you will get a kind of taste of this intersection among creative risk takers. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce you to 4 truly remarkable people. Each of our panelists today has one thing in common, which is why we are gathered. Each of them usually works in one particular aspect of art, but each of them has also written and published a memoir. And so I'm curious and excited to explore how these autobiographical stories came to be and how the art of memoir connects to other manifestations of artistic expression. So first, let me introduce to you Nell Painter. Nell, can you wave so we can identify you? Who since 2020 has been the chair of the MacDowell Board and a 2-time MacDowell Fellow. After a fulfilling career as a publishing Princeton historian, 7 books, notably The History of White People, Nell Painter began again in art school, a move which elicited a great deal of curiosity. In her MacDowell residence in 2016, Nell completed a memoir entitled Old in Art School, which was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Autobiography Award. In 2017, she completed the visual art series You Say This Can't Really Be America. And in 2018, she published an art review of Soul of a Nation, Art in the Age of Black Power in the New York Review Daily. And we will hear more about her memoir very shortly. Riva Lehrer, can you identify yourself? Riva Lehrer is a visual artist as well, and a writer who was born with spina bifida, and her artwork focuses on the socially challenged body. She is best known for representations of people whose physical embodiment, sexuality, or gender identity have long been stigmatized. Her work has been exhibited in venues including the National Portrait Gallery of the Smithsonian, Yale University, the United Nations, the National Museum of Women in the Arts, and the Frye Museum, among others. Her awards include a Ford Foundation Fellowship, a 3 Arts MacDowell Fellowship, Carnegie Mellon Fellowship, and a National Endowment for the Arts grant. Lehrer's memoir, Golem Girl, won the 2020 Barbellion Prize for Literature and was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award. Kira, say hi. Kira Madden is a Chinese Kanaka Maoli writer, photographer, and amateur magician. I don't know if we'll have time for a magic trick at the end, we shall see. A recipient of fellowships from the New York Foundation for the Arts, Hedgebrook, Tin House, MacDowell, and Yaddo, Tikira serves as the founding editor-in-chief of No Tokens, a magazine of literature and art. Her fiction and nonfiction has been featured in Harper's, New York Magazine, and others, and she's the author of the 2019 New York Times Editor's Choice memoir, Long Live the Tribe of Fatherless Girls, which is now being developed as a feature film. A finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award John Leonard Prize, and the winner of the 2021 Judith A. Markowitz Lambda Literary Award. She facilitates writing workshops for homeless and former incarcerated individuals and is an assistant professor of English at the College of Charleston. And with us today, a special guest, Sally Field. Sally is a 2-time Academy Award and 3-time Emmy Award-winning actor whose career has spanned almost 6 decades and dozens of iconic roles on screens large and small. Beginning in 1965 with television's Gidget and The Flying Nun, she won her first Emmy in 1975 for her performance in Sybil, before moving on to have an extensive film credit career, including Forrest Gump, Steel Magnolias, Places in the Heart, Norma Ray, Mrs. Doubtfire, Soap Dish, Smokey and the Bandit, Hello, and Lincoln. Sally made her Broadway debut in Edward Albee's The Goat, or Who is Sylvia, starred in Tennessee Williams' The Glass Menagerie on Broadway in 2017. In early 2019, she starred in the London production of Arthur Miller's All My Sons at the Old Vic, which I had the great pleasure of seeing. Sally Field is a member of the American Academy of the Arts and Sciences, was honored with the National Medal of the Arts from President Obama, and received the prestigious Kennedy Center honor in 2019. Her memoir, In Pieces, was published in 2018 and became an instant New York Times bestseller. Sally and I have known each other for over 20 years, as she was a board member of the Sundance Institute, where for 23 years I oversaw the Sundance Theater Labs. Welcome, everyone. I could easily speak to each one of you for an hour. So today is going to be a kind of amuse-bouche, I would say, an opportunity for us to understand just a bit about what each of these unique artists has to say about the art of making art, as Mr. Sondheim would have put it. And Nell, Madam Chairman, if I may throw you the first question.
Sure.
In your memoir, Old in Art School, you state, quote, "You must not see yourselves through other people's eyes." This line comes, as I recall, toward the end of your narrative. And I wondered if you could talk a bit about the discovery of that insight as you penned your story. Why that particular caution to your reader, you must not see yourselves through other people's eyes?
Yeah, that is at the very end. And it came after a young journalist was interviewing me. And so I'm old and wise, and she was young and smart. But she asked if I had any words of wisdom. And my word of wisdom was, you must not see yourself through other people's eyes. I realized also that that's related to how we approach food in our country, which is actually easier. We know that the food that is marketed to us is not good for us. That's easy to know. But it's harder to know that the glance focused on us, and the young woman, Zara, the journalist, is a dark-skinned African-American woman like me. I said, for us in particular, you must not see yourself through the eyes of your society or through other people's eyes, because that is not a gaze meant to make you feel good about yourself or get through your life. So you need to approach the gaze on yourself of your society, kind of the way you approach the grocery shelves, knowing that packaged food is not good for you, and that the way that most people will see you in your society is not necessarily good for you. It's not all the people. There are people who see you as yourself, and some of them are people who love you. So cherish those people and turn away from the grocery shelf of the American gaze.
Wow.
Is that and
Great
is that
line.
is that something you always knew, or is that something that as you thought over your life you came to?
No, I didn't. I mean, this conversation took place in probably 2011, which was the year that I got my MFA in painting from the Rhode Island School of Design, where either I was invisible or I was vaguely visible as an old lady, as an old Black lady, as an old Black lady academic. So, all these things sort of put together in a kind of grocery shelf way. So no, it took me a long time to find the words.
And this is a big question, but maybe you can encapsulate it. I'm curious, for you, what does creating visual art allow you, Nell Painter, that being an historian or a nonfiction writer might not allow you?
Yeah, lying. As a historian, I was a very scrupulous historian. The archive I had to respect. As a visual artist, I can do whatever I want with it, and I can lie with it. The meaning that I seek is a visual meaning. It's not a discursive meaning. It's not a meaning where we usually talk about truth.
Got it. Sally.
Yes.
Turning to your book In Pieces, which is so aptly titled, the metaphor of identifying the pieces of your life and the challenge of putting those pieces together as a whole. Mm-hmm. And I'm going to also add the anxiety of maybe not having all those pieces really seems to propel your storytelling. Mm-hmm. And I want to say that tension shows up in some way in virtually all the memoirs we're going to talk about today. Like each of you is working through a kind of puzzle or composing a treasure map, trying to find your way toward who you are. And in yours, what makes it very, very unique, Sally, is that you also endeavor to get inside the art of acting, like what it is, mm-hmm. and to help your reader understand what you grew to understand acting to be. Could you share with us what it is to create a character as an actor and how that relates, or maybe not, to creating the story of your life as an author? What do the two forms share, if anything at all?
How I get in, it's almost like I don't even know where to begin with this question, because I never wrote this to share it with anybody. I wrote it because I needed to know. And when I never thought I would even show it to anybody, really. A part of me thought that, a piece of me thought that. And then another piece of me would say, oh, yes, you will. Oh, yes, you will. Oh, yes, you will. Because I had to force myself to learn a new craft. And the only way I could do that would be in really owning, maybe for the first time, owning the craft that I did know. And I had this urgency inside of me to find my mother, basically. And to do that, I had to find all that there was of me chronologically, of how it all built together. Because my work and my mother, acting, the craft of acting, and my mother went together. And so I explored learning the craft of writing through what I knew of acting. And I think I said this to you, I used much of the time I used acting exercises that I do know, that I do use. I used that to write, to go to a place that I could put myself there and then write about it, write it. And never, like Nell said, never, ever did I see this through somebody else's eyes. Never, ever did I think of a reader and what the reader would be seeing. It was always my own urgency to feel this connection of, yes, and as an actor, when you, I was lucky enough to study with Lee Strasberg, and at a very prime time in the actor studio and everything in the 60s and 70s. And so these acting exercises are really a form of self-hypnosis, and going in, not through the front door of I want to know that, but through the back door of your subconscious, of finding a way to step away from your own need to hide from yourself, from pain, from things you don't want to know. And through weird little tools and images and things, room exercises. And I needed to know the things that I didn't want to know. And it's the same thing you do in acting. You step away from the part of yourself, or hopefully, the task is to step away from the part of yourself that doesn't want to go there, doesn't want to find the darkness of your subconscious mind, of not knowing where you are and what you're going to do. And is that my hand? That can't be my hand. And so did that answer your question? I'm not sure. No. It's really such a gift to hear this, because it's a rare opportunity for us to understand. And I will say that in reading your book, as you speak about Strasberg, and even as you audition for various roles, when you're able to explain to us what you needed to do, as you just did, to sort of be inside and to let go of the conscious is really one of the great parts of reading your story. So I wonder, do you have a moment where you feel you could read us a little bit from the beginning of your book so we can sort of understand? But I wanted to just say this, and I'm an actor, so I will probably be the one you have to say, just shut up now. Thank you so much, Sally. That was really, now shut up. Now stop talking. But Nell talked about seeing yourself through other people's eyes. And it's interesting, as an actor, one of the first things you have to do is see yourself through other people's eyes. You have to not be afraid of that. And you have to allow yourself to see yourself through other people's eyes. You walk on a stage. This is a great thing that Lee taught. Walk on a stage, and everybody in the audience sitting there, tell this person what you perceive them to be. Now, the actors on stage is not allowed to say anything or move or do anything. Just stand there. Just walk on stage and stand there. And everybody says, well, very sexy, or very awkward, or very shy, or a tomboy, or whatever it is, you send off as a human being without opening your mouth or using your hands or anything, because you have to own that information. Even before you can step away from it, you have to own it. You have to see it. You have to go, ugh, really? I'm not that way. Oh, yes, you are. Anyway, it's interesting what acting really is.
Yep.
I will read this, and if it goes on too long, just say, yeah, that's enough.
I will.
Okay. There was no proscenium arch, no curtains or lights to create an illusion, no proper stage at all. It was just a classroom with all the chairs and their seventh grade occupants pushed aside in disorganized clumps. It wasn't even a real classroom. The entire school had originally been part of an army hospital built at the end of World War II, specializing in central nervous system injuries, syphilis, and psychiatry. It had once even included a small compound for prisoners of war, a building now stuffed with classrooms and students held captive until the sound of the bell. This particular room was long and narrow, each side lined with windows, which made it look exactly like a hospital ward and nothing like a junior high school drama class. But on that day, through my 12-year-old eyes, I saw only the faint interior of a swank apartment. I remember watching my feet as they stomped across the worn wooden floor, and for one instant, the feet weren't mine anymore. Then I was back in the classroom again, wondering what to do with my hands, my armpits sweating so much I dripped. I stopped at the door, a wobbly contraption hinged to a freestanding frame made by the boys in woodshop, took hold of the handle, then turned back toward the 13-year-old playing my uncouth gangster boyfriend. With one clammy hand gripped to the knob and my whole body twisted around to face the actor, my arm awkwardly wrapped in front of me, I stood listening to the boy deliver his dialogue. When he finished spraying his words through his braces, I paused a beat, then yelled, "Drop dead, Harry," and exited. And exited.
That's great.
An indignant huff, slamming the door behind me. That was it. My first moments as an actor, a scene from Born Yesterday, and my pubescent version of a brassy Brooklyn bombshell Billy Dawn. I wasn't good. I knew I wasn't. It was like Heidi, the little goat girl, had taken a stab at Hedda Gabler, but it didn't matter. A new sensation had brushed past me, and for one moment, I felt free. My body moved, maybe not gracefully, but all on its own, without me telling it where to go. Tiny flashes when it didn't belong to me at all, and I was watching from far away with no anxious sense of time. In those cracks of light, the pressure of what people thought of me or didn't think of me, who they wanted me to be or didn't want me to be, completely stopped. A bell had rung. Everything focused and sharpened. I could hear myself. Then it was gone. In the 8th grade, a year later, I had my first performance night in the school auditorium. For the first time, I walked on stage in front of an audience of parents and friends there to watch, among other things, my Juliet, not the whole play, just 2 scenes, the potion scene and the death scene. My mother drove me home afterward, and I clearly remember sitting in that dark car beside her. I desperately wanted to know what she thought, but was afraid to ask, so I just watched her drive. Sometimes the headlights of an oncoming car would light up the whole interior, making it seem even darker after it passed. But when her face was bright with light, she looked at me, and as if we were hiding from someone, she whispered, "You were magical." I whispered back, "I was?" Then everything was dark again, and I could barely see her at all. "What does that mean?" I asked. Just that. Another flash of headlights lit up the front seat, and I can see her mouth edging toward a smile, the light bleaching her beautiful face white, then slowly fading to black.
That is gorgeous. It's such a gorgeous launch of a story that takes us to places we don't anticipate. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'm going to turn now to you, Riva. And Riva, like Nell, you do something rather remarkable in your book. You talk about making work, like the inside of it, which is, for all of us who don't know how to do that, like a revelation, what it is to paint. I'm really particularly intrigued by one chapter of your book, which explores a series of your paintings called the Risk Pictures. And I wonder if you could talk about the Risk paintings, what they are, how they came to be, and how they relate to walking into fear.
Well, I've been listening to the last, hold on. You guys can hear me, right? Okay. I've been listening to Nell and Sally and thinking about how much in answering your question, how I'm also thinking about what they said in terms of being seen and what it means to be looked at and to look. And for me, one of the difficulties of the book was that let me back up. I get stared at all the time. I'm also often aggressively, more than stared at, abused on the street, verbally, occasionally physically, a whole lifetime of bad encounters with strangers and sometimes not strangers who think that the way I look and the way I walk is completely unacceptable. So I've always had this kind of hyper awareness of being looked at, and becoming a portraitist partly in order to deal with that. Also, in writing my book, I was writing it both for a general audience and people inside disability culture and people inside queer culture, and trying to kind of ping back and forth so I wasn't boring anybody or confusing anybody, and, you know, not being too 101. And anyway, so in terms of portraiture, I'm really interested in people who, like me, undergo stigma for whatever reason. And one of the things I've come to understand is that I get asked a lot about what I think beauty is, as I talk about it all the time. And I think that people who undergo stigma, and oddly enough, actors and some athletes, are people who know their bodies incredibly well. Actors in particular, you know, are being stared at constantly, being assessed constantly. So are disabled people. So often are queer people whose queerness is palpable. Often so are trans people. And this experience of being observed all the time, whether you want to be or not, you know, people of color within certain contexts, same situation. This is what really draws me. And there's a way that people who undergo that know themselves so well, they know what their bodies are and what they need and how they function, and the difference between what people are assuming about you and what you know to be true. There's an intensity that you end up with, this way of like really being in your body in this kind of lustrous, patinaed way that just rivets me. So when I'm doing a portrait, a bunch of things are going on. I'm looking for that. I'm trying to explain what it looks like so that people can see it. I'm also being incredibly careful because the people I choose, as I say, are often also abused by people in their lives, public and otherwise. And so if I'm doing a portrait, I'm staring at someone for a really long time, and that can be painful. So I've been working with all these ethical structures in order to make sure that the people I work with have a lot of power, that they can say no, this needs to change. No, this isn't who I am. You've got it wrong. I mean, it has to kind of come early in the process, because after a certain point, there ain't no erasing anymore. But when I did this series called The Risk Pictures, a couple things were going on. As I said, I've been working for a long time in terms of trying to figure out how to give someone power. And so I'd been wanting to up that, but also I was going through a period of being in the hospital a lot. And so I would be working on something and then have to drop it and go in the hospital for a couple of weeks and come back and try and remember what the hell was I doing, and then it would happen again. And the way I paint and draw is very tight. It's very controlled. And it started to feel like a lie, like I had this control in my studio that didn't exist anywhere else in my life. And I wanted to bring chaos into the work. And at first I tried to like loosen up my arm, and I just can't. It's just not how I think. So I started thinking about other ways of using chaos. So what I do now is when I do someone's portrait, up until COVID, we set up a series of live sittings. They come to my studio, and each one is a 3-hour sitting. And at the 2-hour mark, I walk out and I give them total control of my house and everything I own. And they are welcome to do anything, and I will never ask them what they do, up into including breaking things, stealing things, eating things, whatever. But in exchange, they have to alter their portrait while I'm gone. And so it's a contract. if I come back and they haven't done it, then things start to fall apart. Luckily, people have relaxed into it and started to be more daring as time goes on. But it's scary. It's called the risk picture is not only because I'm risking everything I have. I don't know if they're going to ruin the portrait while I'm gone. They could like do something. I had an experience with one portraitist that while I was out, she was supposed to call me when she was ready for me to come back. And I was waiting and waiting and waiting. She wasn't coming back. And finally she calls me, and we had set up sort of a plan about what she was going to do. And she called me and she said, Riva, I think I effed it up. And I'm like, oh God, what did she? I'm like imagining her going to my refrigerator and getting the ketchup and the mustard and just like, I didn't know what to expect. So it's really been about trying to learn not to protect myself and stay on the safe side of the easel. I want both sides of the easel to be equally fraught, and for people to be, I want to change, and I want to change my subject through vulnerability. So I know that's a long answer. Thank you for listening through that.
Well, it's extraordinary. And I will say, as one reads your book and you come to the section about leaving the house and you say some of what you just said, the reader gets very worried. But then when you see the paintings and what each of the individual people who sat for you have done, it's breathtaking. It's absolutely breathtaking. So, and those photos, like Nell's photos are in her book, your photos are in your book, really, really extraordinary. And I'm going to ask you actually now, if you don't mind, hold on a second. No, actually, I'm going to wait on this. I want to get to Tikira for a minute, and then I'm going to come back to having you read us a piece. Okay. If you don't mind, because I want to talk about parents. Because each one of you had a clear need to examine your mothers and fathers. And I guess parents, not surprisingly, will show up in books that are autobiographical. And I want to ask you, Kira, about your book, which I will say in some ways sometimes is an extraordinarily harrowing and sometimes hilarious tale of being a young child and then a teenager with very, very challenging adults around you. And what comes across so poignantly for the reader is your loving your mother and loving your father, both of whom were serious addicts. I wondered to begin if you could share with us the impetus to tell this story, like the moment you felt it was the right moment, the imperative time. Sometimes in theater, we call this with the playwright, the animating impulse that made you make the book. Can you give us a little insight into that?
Sure. Thank you. And thank you everyone for sharing these stories. I'm just floored. I'm so honored to be here. So I was traditionally a fiction writer, and I had gone to school for fiction. I was teaching and writing fiction. And my first day at MacDowell was actually as a fiction fellow. And I had applied again as a fiction writer. And I was actually at my father's deathbed in the hospital when I received that acceptance from MacDowell to come back. And he died. And the dates that were offered to me were the month after he had died. And I didn't know how I could possibly do that, how I could possibly leave and go to this space and write and work on a novel. But I did, and I got there, and what I realized as soon as I got there day one was that I can't work on this novel right now, this novel I'd been writing for years, and instead I had the experience. The writer Maggie Nelson has described this as the boulder book. A boulder comes rolling in, and you have to write into that boulder before you can access what's on the other side, and that's exactly what happened. As soon as I got there, I tried to write fiction. I tried to write the novel, and instead it was just my father. It was just all of these questions. And he is the first, major person that I have lost in my life. And I was kind of wrestling with this idea of we have these these ideas, I think, as writers and artists, that everything has the arc, everything has the dramatic arc and has some sort of conclusion and has some sort of tidiness to it. And losing my father kind of midway through that arc with all of these unanswered questions didn't make sense to me. So instead of writing the story I knew I had been wanting to write in the novel, I started investigating questions for the first time, everything I didn't know, and writing those questions down every single day and just seeing what happened as I wrote into that boulder. Mm. And so it really was definite timing. But I relate to so much of what's been said here too, where I didn't know that these were really pages that I would share with anyone necessarily. I wasn't thinking about it that way. I thought, at the time I was 27, like who would want to read a memoir by a 27-year-old? I had been told that in academic institutions growing up, like go out, live your life before you write about it. But writing about it, I realized there is so much truth in the saying, you have everything you need by the time you're maybe 9 years old. And then I actually had a lot to say for myself and for my community.
I'm going to ask you to read a piece of your book now. And I was going to ask you the question about explaining to us a little bit about the character of Uncle Nuke, who sort of starts your book and actually ends your story. And I wondered if it would be okay for you to read a little bit of that.
Of course, yes. So these were the first pages I wrote at MacDowell, and somehow they remained the first pages of the book, which never happens. Everything else is out of order, but this remained the same. So this is called Uncle Nuke. My mother rescued a mannequin from the JCPenney dump when I was 2 years old. He was a full-bodied jewelry mannequin, fancy, distinguished. Those were the words she used. Her father, my grandfather, worked the counter day and night, slinked antique chains and strands of jade across velvet placemats, and felt the mannequin did no work for his numbers. He's pow, done. Grandfather said this with both elbows bent in a chopping motion. The mannequin would have to go. In this part of the story, my mother and I live alone in Coconut Grove, Florida. We're in a canary yellow apartment dammed with beanbag ashtrays, field mice, the guts of flashlights and remote controls, and a shag carpet that feels sharp all the way under the shag. She's single, my mother, the crimson-mouthed mistress of my father, a white man, who was back home in downtown Miami with his artist wife and his 2 handsome boys. Soon my father will move my mother and me into a porn director's apartment and then to Boca Raton, the rat's mouth, to start over, but none of us knows this yet. My mother, a Chinese Hawaiian pocket knife of a woman, shot a man once. She tells me the story all the time, how the strange man tried to crawl through her window, naked, choking out his cock as she slipped into a nightgown. She shot him in the shoulder with a boyfriend's .357 Magnum, his body spat out like a rag doll into the liquid black night. He landed in the street too far to be trespassing, so she dragged him by the legs back on her lawn for more. The man was paralyzed for the rest of his life. He threatened to sue, but my mother never once regretted this incident. But this is how it was in Coconut Grove in the 1980s and early 90s. Bandits, robbers, glass stems on the sidewalk, bad men doing bad under the bridge. My mother had little to defend in that first apartment of ours, a few gems from her father, frosted Christmas ornaments, her Chinese jade, some cash. But then there was me. We needed a man in our home, a figure bigger than us, she said, to scare off all the other men who would come. All this to say that the reason she rescued that mannequin, the reason she wrapped her arms wickedly tight around his waist, carrying him to the back seat of our Volvo, where the top half of his body slung out the window, his bald head pat-pattering under the rain on our car ride home, all the reason she did anything, the wrong things, the strange things, the dangerous, the sublime, the reason she does any of it still is to protect me. Remember this.
Wow.
Yeah. It's an extraordinary launch of a story that goes in very unpredictable places. Really gorgeous. Since we're talking about parents, I'm going to ask for two more readings quickly, because Riva, your mom is indelible, Carol, a fiercely protective woman with her own, I would say, personal demons. And I wondered if you could grace us with a brief reading from your book about your mom.
Thank you, Philip. Okay, let me get that back. Here's just a little bit you need to know. The year is 1968. I'm 10 years old. It's the week before Hanukkah, and I'm watching my mother sew a new dress for the holidays. This is kind of a look at her, sort of at her best, before a lot of really bad stuff happens. And every every chapter title in the book is named after a horror movie or a horror film. Chapter 10, House of Wax. My mother had wanted to be a fashion designer. She'd won a scholarship to Pratt, but her parents demanded that she attend pharmacy school. They'd allowed her older brother, Lester, to attend art school, and someone had to take over the family business, so that was that. She escaped after a year by virtue of a lab accident involving a Bunsen burner and a quantity of magnesium. She flash blinded herself, a blindness that lasted for several months. I don't know if Carol was a chemistry genius or a future liability for the pharmaceutical industry. Carol loved clothing with an unrequited passion, even considering that the fashion industry pretended that she didn't exist. When my brother Doug and I were 8 or 9, she'd take us downtown on the bus all the way to the Cincinnati Art Museum. Our final pilgrimage was always to Gainsborough's Anne Ford, later Mrs. Philip Thickness, so that we might marvel at the satin gown, a cascade of frothing silver. Anne Ford herself was an afterthought, a vehicle for the glory of that dress. And Carol was always a dress-loving woman, not for her the plebeian pantsuit, the wash-and-wear slacks. These days, she consoled herself by drawing wasp-waisted debutantes in Dior new-look frocks. She'd never find such things in her size because Carol Sue Horowitz Lehrer took after her father. Sam Horowitz was height times width times girth times appetite, 6'2" at a time when Jewish men were built like Woody Allen. Now, big men could get clothes because big men got respect. But Lane Bryant was the only store that served big women, offering a range of shame-based garments that ran the gamut from drab to saggy to punitively asexual. The dresses that my mother made were beautifully cut and daringly anti-Bryantly colorful, graced with embroidery on the collar, tiny jewels at the neck, lace and velvet trim at the sleeves and hem. She caused a small sensation when she swanned down the road in one of her own creations. More than once, I saw a lady grab her sleeve and demand, "Where did you get that? Can I buy it from you? You made it? Oh, please, please make me one." I feared that someday an admirer would peel my mother like a banana and run away, clutching the purloined gown like a golden fleece.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Yeah, she's a remarkable person whose life story is very much part of your book as well, and really, really worth getting to know. I want to end this little chapter of, we have some questions, but I want to end this little chapter of hearing work by asking Nell, who also writes about her mother and her father very much, as she is returning to school, to read a little bit that puts us in touch with your parentage.
I say in Olden Art School that my mother gave me the wherewithal to write a memoir. She herself wrote a memoir, and she used the word old in the title. But the fact of her writing as an old woman and talking about old gave me permission to do so also. But in a conversation you and I had a while ago, Philip, you were interested in how my book changed as I wrote it. And what I would like to share with you is something I didn't know. It involves my mother and involves me, something I didn't know until I wrote. And the chapter is called A Bad Decision. So I am an undergraduate at Mason Gross School of the Arts at Rutgers in my last year. What colors were these? I couldn't name them, just a mood, desperate, without clarity to give that mood a name. Those colors were showing up in my paintings, wan, desaturated grays and browns, reds drained of life, blues bereft of light, reflections of my desaturated life. I'm going backward here, for my mother hadn't yet died, but she was heading only one way. We hadn't said die, but already death overlaid me. Something new was showing up in a shape I couldn't discern. It felt like limits. I'd never felt the boundaries of my lifetime before, but now in a new way, unfocused yet definite, my years no longer seemed to stretch out before me. At the same time, I didn't feel lifetime boundaries as boundaries on my life. This will sound muddled. I was muddled. It wasn't that I exactly felt hurried, but I absolutely had to move on urgently. As my mother sank in my transcontinental parental drama, and I should explain that I was in New Jersey and my parents were in Oakland, my hometown. As my mother sank in my transcontinental parental drama, urgency, that's how it felt. Urgency led me astray. Instead of spending a fourth year honing my skills as a Mason Gross undergraduate, I decided to apply to graduate school. Where was my common sense? What on earth was I thinking? How could I not have connected my mother's decline to my irritations with Mason Gross? How did I fail to see the impact of repeated cross-country trips, each time throwing myself up against my mother's destiny and my father's misery? Those correlations, so glaringly obvious to me now, so clearly recognizable as the very reasons that even internet therapy warns you not to make life-altering decisions in the midst of psychological turmoil. Those correlations I failed to make at the time. Rather than thinking, I felt. I felt irritation at Mason Gross, where my studies and my fellow students had formerly offered so much pleasure. My mother lay dying. I had to get out of graduate school. And then just a little more. It turns out that it is harder to get into an MFA program in painting than to get into a Princeton PhD program, because MFA painting programs are smaller, but similar numbers apply. I was hurling my old academic Black self against the stone wall of graduate art school admission impossibility, with a conviction born of defiance. No longer a mere step along the way into painting seriously, graduate school loomed before me like a wall, a mountain, an obstacle test of my personal worth. This is no way to make a decision. Oh, geez, no.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. I'm realizing I have, like 726 more questions, but I'm going to, because we're coming toward the end of this hour, throw out just a couple of questions for each of you to answer, if you can answer in a kind of short way. I'm really curious about these questions. The first one I'd love to hear from all of you, maybe starting with Sally. And the question is, if you had never written your memoir, would something be lost for you?
Oh my God, yes. Oh my God, yes. It's a great quote. I think it's George Eliot that I would always say and never knew why I was saying it. It's never too late to be what you might have been. And had I not done that, originally always just writing for myself and writing for myself, I would not have known that there was a big piece of me that desperately wants to write, not just my own story. It is some part of me that I walked away from, that I said I wasn't smart enough, I didn't have the education, I wasn't good enough, I wasn't this, I wasn't that. And I was always an actor. It's then I had to make a living and I had to da-da-da-da. But I started writing this to find my mother. Oddly, her loss was the beginning of this, or not oddly. And the way she always led me, always, all my life, through even the times when I was confused by her and angry at her and felt she'd let me down. I felt even after her death, she led me to a place I didn't know I needed to go. And that is, there's a huge part of me undiscovered yet at the age of mid-70s. I need to keep exploring that, even though it still frightens me. It frightens me that I don't know how, all of those things. But had I not done this, I would not have found that desire, the deep passion that I have to find what's left of me.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you. Tikira, you are the youngest person on this call, already an accomplished artist. What about you? What would have been lost, if anything, if you didn't write your memoir?
What a beautiful question. So much. I think if you read the book quite literally, I unearthed all these secrets through having difficult conversations with my family. I interviewed everyone in the book, and some of those interviews are in it. And my life would be very, very different, very literally, if I didn't find what I found that comes into this book. But also, I think my reason, I think about myself as a child, and so much of this book takes place as a child, an only child, in a house with two parents with substance abuse issues and absences. And I'm a very shy person. I was a very shy person then. And in a way, I think this book is the first time I could tell my story about what happened to me and my life without being interrupted in some way. And that's a privilege and that's an honor. And I think to now meet people who have read the book and whose story, connects to it, or if my story resonated with them, we can meet in these signing lines, we can meet through emails or mail. And that is a gift, that I can now have this open dialogue. I can kind of release the pressure of some of that shame that so many children with my experience or with a household of addicts have, and instead say it's okay and find that kind of transcendent connection with others. So it's been the gift of my life, truly.
Wow, what a beautiful discovery. Riva, if you hadn't written the book, what would be different, do you think?
Well, it seems like it's Mother's Day here. Tikira, my mother also dealt with addiction because of catastrophic medical malpractice. And my memories of her were so colored by her last really, really terrible, heartbreaking years. And the book started as a book when I was home in Cincinnati in 2014, and I was actually just writing a document for my family to explain my work so that after I was gone, they'd have something that they could use to deal with my stuff as my executors. And so I was talking to the family, and these stories started to come up about my mother that I completely did not know. totally changed not only my understanding of myself, but of her. But the big thing that's happened since then, even since the book has come out, is that I've heard from all these people who knew her, and they would describe the woman that got lost, this like, I'm going to tear up. I mean, this like brilliant, funny, warm, charismatic, talented woman that was just completely destroyed by the circumstances of her life. And so I think, and there are a lot of other ways I could answer that, but I think the most important thing is that I got my mother back.
Yeah.
And it made me really feel her loss gonna stop talking now.
Yeah.
Well, that's the thing about all of these books. They are your life stories, but they're also other people's life stories embedded in these books. I mean, you can almost make a story out of any one of your parents' life stories or other people, brothers and sisters, because what you've all done is you've needed to and made these remarkable discoveries. Nell, finally for you, what would it have been if you had never written Old in Art School?
It let me be bolder in the world because, as I said, in A Bad Decision, I could see that. I could see and name that I made a bad decision, and I could see and I could name that I had done poor work, that I could be a failure, that there are all these, maybe it's because of my family, maybe it's because I'm a Black woman from the 20th century of a certain class, but I did go through life more protected, and writing this very personal book let some of the protection down.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, the one word that comes to mind, having just read them all again, and the second reads were even more exciting than the first, was the kind of honesty and the walking into, but I said something to you before, walking into fear. It felt like you were very, very brave, all of you. Unfortunately, we're at our time limit. It feels like we just did an appetizer and we're all hungry for the entree to arrive. I suppose that I would suggest the entree, really the next course would likely be reading these beautiful stories. I hope people who are watching will do that. It's fascinating that none of the stories were my story, obviously, but the more specific they are, the more they contain a kind of universality, as all good art, good writing does. And I think that reading them, does nothing but bring every reader closer to themselves and to their place in the world. So I want to thank you all for that. I want to thank the 92nd Street Y and remind folks that our collaboration with them continues. Nell Painter is the moderator for 2 more events coming up, which you'll be hearing about, very exciting ones. And to everybody, thank you for your time and your generosity today.
Thank you, Philip. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
So honored
Thank you,
to
everyone.
all of you.
Great.
And
So much
I did
fun.
read everybody's book. They're all wonderful. They're all wonderful.